The first time a fake patrol golf cart rolled up my driveway, I thought it was a prank. Then the man in the cheap polyester vest leaned on the steering wheel and told me, plain and slow, that I needed to join the neighborhood association or else. And that little sentence, the little thread, is where everything that followed began to live. I'd owned the land for 3 months. 2 acres that slipped just outside the cul-de-sac rules. Bought because it wasn't under someone else's thumb. And I liked it that way, quiet. Simple. Mine until someone else decided it was theirs to command. My name is Eli Mercer. I used to wear a badge. I don't anymore. But I'd spent 2 decades around people who did. And I'd learned to read a man by the way he stood and by how his eyes moved when he lied. I had no intention of being dramatic about it. I wasn't looking for a fight. I just wanted to sit on my porch with coffee, watch the sunlight hit the oaks, and not sign up for someone else's rules. That's the thing about small pieces of land. They feel like freedom until you find out they're really a map of other people's expectations. It started small, flyers stuck into my mailbox like teeth. A stack of yellowing notices about community standards. And one particularly cheerful letter stamped with the HOA's logo that demanded adherence to aesthetic requirements. Mostly it was paperwork and nerves passive aggression in ink. But then the little patrol cart showed up, with its glossy decal slapped on the side and a flashing blue LED taped to the roof. The man driving it, a guy named Gage Monroe, wore a thrift store vest with a patch that said Neighborhood Patrol and a smile like he'd been practicing it in the mirror. "You don't belong here yet," he said. He had a slight southern lull in his speech, the kind of drawl people soften when they're trying to sound authoritative. "You got 10 days to register with the association or we're going to start filing fines." He tapped a clipboard like he'd practiced his authority. I told him the property line county records. Deed numbers showed my lot outside their jurisdiction. He shrugged like the map might have been printed wrong. That shrug was the beginning. After the first visit, the notices got bolder bright red spray-painted words on my mailbox. Tire tracks on the lawn at night. A spotlight cutting across the porch at 2 a.m. Once, someone left a small pile of chewed nails by my front step, like a metaphor for what they were willing to do. It doesn't look like much until you're staring at it in the morning. Coffee gone lukewarm. Wondering which neighbor has decided your life is their problem. People in town will tell you there are 2 kinds of neighbors, the ones who wave and the ones who try to manage your life from their own porch. Verna Klein, the HOA president, was both proud and practiced at that management. She wore her cardigan like armor, and she had a way of smiling with her mouth and not her eyes, which is how you know someone's practiced generosity for an audience. I ran into her once, at a community bake sale that she'd organized. She asked me where I planned to put a fence, as if the positioning of my fence were an ethical question and not a line of wood. I gave her the county plat, the surveyor's stamped drawing, and her smile tightened like a rubber band. "You understand what a neighborhood is, don't you, Mr. Mercer?" she asked. "We take care of our own standards." Her words were pleasant, but there's a pressure in polite sentences when they carry the weight of a committee. She was the kind of person who read chapter headings aloud at meetings and then called noncompliance an oversight. If this had been about a mailbox or a paint color, someone might have sighed and handed over the dues. But my property wasn't about curb appeal. There was an old barn that had survived decades of storms, a sliver of creek that cut through cattails, and a meandering row of pecan trees I'd planted for shade. People like us stubborn. Private buy places like that because we want to be untethered. And when an association begins to push like it owns the right to tether you, 2 things happen. You get stubborn, or you get scared. I chose stubborn first, and then the fear crept in later, slow and precise. When Gage first showed a gun at his hip, it didn't feel like a movie, it felt like a wrong detail in a quiet neighborhood. Like someone had misplaced the tone of a conversation. He'd come back one hot afternoon, the cart idling with a hum, and he wanted compliance now. "This is for community safety," he said, hand resting near the holster. He wasn't wearing a uniform. The polyester vest was a poor disguise. The LED light a toy. But the gun was real, and the way he let his hand rest near it made my chest go cold. "You're trespassing," I told him. And I meant the idea. He didn't have the right to enforce anything on my land. He leaned forward, close enough I could smell the coffee on his breath, and said, "We're authorized to enforce the covenants." He said authorized like he'd swallowed a book of rules and chewed it into trust. You can save us all some trouble by signing up now. I didn't sign. I couldn't sign. The law wasn't fuzzy here. The county line was a clean edge in the surveyor's ink. But Gage had something else, a willingness to make me uncomfortable. To escalate. Intimidation is a slow biology. It picks at the edges until you bend. I called the county zoning office that afternoon. Explained the visit. And they confirmed what my deed already said: my land was outside the HOA boundaries. That should have been enough. Paper often is. But paper doesn't stop a man willing to stand in your yard and look like he owns the story. At night, my porch felt smaller. I caught myself pausing before I walked out. Listening. The house makes different sounds under suspicion: boards that creak and sigh. A dog barking that you can hear like a distant radio. One night, I stepped onto the porch and found a note hammered to the post with attack. Neighborhood standards are for everyone. The handwriting was neat. The sort practiced. Someone had printed it like they were making a point in a meeting. Not leaving a threat at someone's doorstep. But the message held a knife in its tone. I started recording. Not because I thought I'd end up on the evening news, but because I wanted to remember how the voices sounded when I had to recount them later: the thrum of the cart, the derisive chuckle when I asked for paperwork, the clipped cadence of Verna when she said, "It's for the good of the community." If you've ever lived through an escalation, you learn quickly that memory is a weapon. So I saved every call, every paper, every visit. People in town are good at pretending not to hear. At first, my neighbors called it a quarrel or political. Our neighbor Jeff, who built guitars in his garage, knocked on my door one afternoon with a tray of beer and said, "Keep your head down, Eli." Folks get heated. He's the kind of man who keeps his opinion in a jar and tightens the lid. Another neighbor, Rosa, gave me a look that spoke 3,000 years of women's silence and said, "Don't poke the hornet's nest. Small towns have gravity. Gossip orbits that gravity. You learn who will step into the light with you and who will watch from the hedges." The conflict became kinetic in a way I hadn't expected. Gage started showing up with others: an older man in reflective sunglasses who did the paperwork, a young kid who stood like he'd been rehearsed for a commercial, and always Verna's polite voice on the back end, calling meetings, issuing memos. Once, they broke a gate post and left the jagged stump as evidence of a boundary correction. Another time, someone cut the leg off my mailbox and set it in the yard like a trophy. I didn't want war. War makes monsters of ordinary people. But the ugliness of what they were doing made me honest with myself. If I didn't push back with clarity and calm, it would metastasize. So I called the sheriff. Not as an act of bravado, but because the presence of law would put a frame around what was happening. The dispatcher was kind and practical, and 2 deputies came within an hour. They took statements, looked at the damage, and wrote notes that would live in a file. They left with professional faces, but the presence of their patrol car, steady, dark silhouette, made my porch feel like a place with rules again. That night, emboldened and relieved, I went to the community board's annual meeting with a stack of printed county records tucked under my arm. I didn't want malice. I wanted public clarity. When I stood up to speak, the room smelled like lemon cleaner and stale coffee, and Verna's eyes cut to me like a judge's. I introduced myself and my parcel and set my papers on the table: the map, the surveyor's stamp, the deed. I could feel faces leaning either toward me or away. Verna smiled, that practice smile. "Mr. Mercer," she said, voice warm. "We've always tried to keep things neighborly." I laid out the timeline, the notices, the cart, the spotlight, the broken post, the gun, and the deputy's visit. I watched the room turn. Some hands stayed clasped, others unclenched. I didn't point my finger. I didn't shout. That'd be theater. Instead, I told what happened like someone retelling a storm: what happened. In order. With the evidence arranged like weather in a log book. When I finished, there was a beat of silence that felt like a held breath. Verna's neat tone became thin. "Accusations like that could be libelous," she said, voice steady. And it was a modern sort of threat, legal and shaped into civility, but in a different fold of silence. I saw the truth. A few people were uncomfortable because the tidy story they'd been told had cracks. After that meeting, things changed again, and not for the better. Gage and his friends seemed to ratchet up their boldness, as if insisting would make the law bend. They began to show up in the evenings, inching closer, murmuring over the fence, making jokes meant to sting. One night, as twilight fell, I stepped outside to find Gage standing with his palms up like he expected a handshake. "You sure you want to make waves, Eli?" he asked. Casual. And the threat lived in the casualness. His hand brushed the holster at his hip in a way that wasn't accidental. I remember exactly what I did. I stayed calm. But I didn't show fear. Fear invites predators because it promises vulnerability. I called the sheriff again, this time from the porch, loud enough so Gage could hear. "No weapons on private property," I told him. And then I added, quietly, in case things twisted into an ugly spiral, "I'll wait here with the recorder on." He laughed softly, like a man stealing from a store who doesn't yet see the security camera. He left, spinning the cart away with the LED blinking like a cheap tooth. The one that changed everything happened on a Tuesday morning. I was outside fixing the fence with my neighbor Jeff, the two of us, cursing about stubborn nails and the weather when the cart crested the hill. This time it was flanked by a black SUV, and a man I didn't recognize wearing a bright polo and a belt full of tools. He didn't bother with the pretense of a patrol vest. He carried himself like someone used to making deals. When he stepped out, he was followed by Verna, her sunglasses perfect against the sun. She had a look of righteousness that had hardened into entitlement. "This is harassment," I said, because someone had to say it aloud. "We're enforcing community safety," the new man said, and his name was Peter Hale. He said, "we," as if the town had gathered into his hands. He'd arranged people. I realized the gear, the cart, the narratives rehearsed until they sounded like truth. Then Gage did something stupid or brave, depending on who tells the story. He put his hand on his holster and said, loud enough, that if I didn't sign, they'd start towing my equipment and levying fines. There was a crack in the air like a whip. My throat closed, not from fear of the weapon so much as from disgust at how easy it was for someone to make us small with their props. I walked up to him, close, face to face. I didn't reach for the gun. I didn't make a show. Instead, I looked at him. And in that moment, the story shifted because of what I chose to do next. I used my voice low, steady, and I said, "You don't have authority here. You're making a scene on private property. If you reach for that weapon, you're making an arrest for yourself." It was a strange, precise sentence. But here's the secret. When you've been around law, you learn how to read a man's hands. Gage's hand faltered. He wasn't a trained officer. He was a bully performing an image. A trained officer's posture, even when dangerous, is calibrated. A bully's is a bluff that trembles at touch. Before things could spin into something worse, the distant line of radio static followed by a real patrol car siren closed on us. I'd called the sheriff earlier, and the deputies, who knew me by now, pulled up slow and professional. They stepped out, uniforms crisp in the morning light, and the presence of actual authority, not fake vests. Not community decals, put a frame around the chaos. The deputies asked questions, took statements. They looked at the cart, at Gage's belt, at the shiny things and the taped-on patches. That's when it truly unraveled. Gage couldn't produce any credentials because he had none. Peter Hale, it turned out, had a long history of being a consultant on neighborhood compliance, and Verna's insistence had been the coin he'd accepted. The deputies were patient, methodical. They read the evidence. And then the law did its ordinary thing. It asked questions. Someone in that group had hired a private man to do their dirty work. And when you pay for intimidation, you make a chain of culpability. The sheriff's office began an inquiry. The paperwork arrived in a stack so heavy it felt like the town itself might finally notice. What I remember most from that moment is the quiet after the sirens. The cart that had seemed so full of menace looked ridiculous, a little vehicle that could be rented for a bachelor party. Not a symbol of enforcement. Gage's grin thinned. Verna's face showed a flash of something like surprise. then the quick assembly of a defense. People will do a lot of damage while they believe they're untouchable, and then they write memos explaining why the damage was reasonable. The investigators dug in. They found receipts linking Peter to a small LLC that specialized in neighborhood management. They found messages, emails, and texts that nodded toward payments and taking care of the parcel. They found that Gage had bought a set of patches online and printed them out. It's often the small, mundane things that reveal a plan: invoices, receipts, location data. Evidence isn't drama. It's a paper trail, and it's slow and certain. Verna was called in for questioning. She put on her cardigan like armor and tried to arrange her face into civility. But the questions were precise and legal, not polite. When you build power on a foundation of standards, the law is patient with you until you become violent. It's a strange thing to watch, the soft-spoken tyrant reduced to grant applications and check stubs. I never wanted vengeance. I wanted the record corrected, the gate fixed, the mailbox returned. The investigators gave me a list of options, and I listened like someone reading a ledger: civil suits, criminal complaints, community mediation. The law moves at its own cadence, and at times it's maddeningly not cinematic. The case against Peter and Gage went forward. There were hearings, lots of them, and subpoenas served like small, serious birds landing at doors. The county prosecutor described a conspiracy to harass a homeowner into compliance. And the words sounded weighty because they applied to ordinary things: money, coercion, misrepresentation. Verna was charged with solicitation and complicity. She maintained her dignity in public and her lawyer in private. Some people defended her, insisting she'd only wanted to keep property values stable. But when you confuse property aesthetics with intimidation, you meet a line where law intervenes. In the aftermath, I didn't feel triumphant. There's no party that follows a scuffle with your neighbors. Instead, there was a strange relief, like a pressure easing in a wound. My fence got fixed. The gate returned. The mailbox remounted on a sturdy post. Jeff brought over a new set of nails and signed one quietly, like a benediction. Rosa refused to begrudge anyone, but she brought pies the day the deputies handed me the final report: the small, human courtesies that stitch a community back together. I talk about this because the story isn't about me as a hero. It's about how ordinary people can find themselves in extraordinary situations simply for wanting to be left alone. It's about the temptation of authority, how a woman with a pen and a board can start to believe her own rules are law, and how a man with a vest can mistake bluster for legitimacy. It's about the ordinary things that build up into a pile you can't ignore: a spotlight, a broken post, a taped-on badge. Step by step, it becomes larger than the initial act. What I learned, counting the months afterward, is that the heart of the conflict was fear, not my fear exactly, but the fear people carry when they feel their control slipping. Verna was terrified of a place that didn't conform to her standards. And fear makes people do strange things. For the people who watched, some were ashamed, some were relieved, and others simply copied the model until they learned what the law would tolerate. There's a clarity that comes when the dust settles, when you can stand on your porch again and watch sunlight stitch up the gaps in the fence. I still walk the property at dawn, check the gate, listen to the creak. I talk to Jeff about guitars, to Rosa about her roses. And sometimes I see Verna at the market and we offer a nod that doesn't pretend the past wasn't there. We live beside each other, tied by roads and shared mailboxes, and that means we have to figure out how to be neighbors without turning every difference into an edict. This isn't a story that ends with dramatic last lines or a tidy moral. Truth is messy. The prosecutor closed the case with a plea deal for the lesser actors and a stronger charge against the organizer. There was a fine and a public apology pressed out like a piece of dough. People talked about community standards a lot after that, and the HOA had to revise their bylaws to set clearer boundaries, the sort of humdrum bureaucracy that quietly prevents another Gage from getting a patch and a toy light and thinking power belongs to him. If there's a takeaway I want you to have, it's this: authority without accountability invites abuse. A badge is a responsibility. A patch is not. If someone tells you to sign away part of your life because it's for the community, ask questions calm. Smart questions and keep receipts. Take pictures. Save emails. Call the deputies if you feel unsafe. The law is slow and imperfect, but it's structured to correct what a mob of petty tyrants cannot manage. And your voice matters. The person who stands up and lays the paper on the table is rarely the loudest in the room, but usually the most consequential. This story landed me in courtrooms for a while, and then in quiet afternoons, repairing a fence I hadn't known I loved so much. I look at the pecan trees and think about how stubborn trees are, how they root into place and weather people's tempers. The land didn't change because of the fight. It was the people who moved around it who eventually learned the borders. I don't pretend I'm a hero. I'm just a guy who wanted coffee on his porch in a quiet yard, who answered intimidation with evidence and patience. That's not glamorous. It feels honest. So tell me, what would you have done? Would you have signed to save the trouble, shut your mouth and taken the fines, or stood up and asked for deputies? Papers. The slow patience of paperwork. Drop a comment and tell the truth of what you'd do, because I'd rather read honesty than applause. Share a story if you've got one, about a neighbor who overstepped, about an HOA that crossed a line, about a time the rules became a weapon. Hit subscribe if you believe small towns should protect people more than postcards. And if you want to see more stories about the quiet, strange warfare of community life. If nothing else, tell the neighbor you respect that land belongs to whoever holds the deed, not whoever waves the loudest.